Hello, everyone. So we will be talking about empathy and how it is not the only thing we need as UX researcher or even designer. As was mentioned, my name is Tiziana. I'm not even going to bother you with my last name. And I am a UX psychologist and interaction design consultant, and I'm an educator and a speaker. I'm originally from Milan, Italy. This is it. But I moved in San Diego a long time ago, and that's where I live. And I usually like to start my talking a little bit about my path, my career path, because I want to show that, especially to younger designer or researcher, that what you decide now doesn't have to be your lifetime career. So I started as a graphic designer and then moved to web development and web design, then UX design. And then after getting my master in media psychology, I became a UX psychologist. So I did a lot of like twists and turns in my career. And in case you're wondering what the heck is a UX psychologist, what I actually do, I consult with different company and organization to create ethical, inclusive, and effective experiences. I speak at organization like this or conference and Bright, and I talk about UX, psychology, ethics, media, and the intersection of those. And I also train. I write curriculum and create and teach college classes, and I also offer corporate trainings. But throughout all I do, I always feel that all I do really is share what I know and learn from others. And this is what makes me really, really happy. So today we're going to look at 4 different things. We're going to look why psychology is so important for user research and design, how psychology can supercharge your career, and how to be trauma informed in applying user research. And finally, we'll talk about ethics a little bit, because of course, every time you're talking about psychology, you also have to be very, very careful to do it in an ethical way. So let's start out with why psychology. So you probably learn about human-centered design and putting people, user, consumer in the center, and doing great user experience and user research and all those kind of things, which are really important. But I really like this quote that say, if you really want to focus on humans, you need to understand how human thinks. So basically, you need to have a focus on human psychology, because technology and design and tools change over time. But the human psychology, the way our brain works, our desire, emotion, motivation, they change very, very little. So we probably still behave very similarly of what our ancestors were behaving. So the first thing I want you to understand is that humans are not logical beings. A lot of time, people think that we always go through our pros and cons every time we need to make a decision, and we always choose what's best for us. But this is not what happened at all. In fact, humans are strongly influenced by emotion, and humans are 2 different brains, meaning 2 different way of reasoning. One is called System 1 and System 2 from David Kahneman, who's the Nobel Prize winner that came up with this idea originally. And that means that humans make most of their choice unconsciously. In fact, he calculated that about 95% of all our action and behaviors are automatic, fast, and intuitive without basically thinking. Now, why would that be? Well, because System 2, our reasoning, our thinking, pro and cons, is a lot of hard work. And the human brain has only limited resources, and therefore has evolved towards smarter and not harder. And how does it do that? Well, you use some kind of mental shortcuts. So first of all, we will talk about it a little bit, and you probably heard about it, cognitive biases and also heuristic. So they're just shortcuts or pattern of thinking that work in most cases, but they can also lead us astray. And then mental models, which are basically ideas how things work based on past experience and intuition. Now, I don't like the word biases as much, but just to prove you that are very, very helpful. So imagine you're going to a super important meeting and this is the weather outside. You probably will bring a raincoat or an umbrella, maybe get a cab or an Uber so that you don't get wet. So it's a pretty logical, and it's really, really important that you would do a quick decision like this. Now, does that mean that it's gonna rain 100%? No, probably not. but the chance that it will rain are probably pretty high. So it's great that you're using this kind of shortcut to say, okay, really dark, gloomy sky, probably is going to rain, therefore I'm going to bring an umbrella. So this is why our brain evolved in this way, to be able to make a lot of quick decisions. Otherwise, we're never going to get anything done. However, sometimes those quick decisions can lead us to wrong conclusion. And this is when our shortcuts become a problem. And this is what you probably heard as far as cognitive biases. I know some that were posted in the announcement for this event, but I'm going to mention just a few. There being about 220 biases right now collected. So if you go to your cognitive bias codex, you can just Google it. It will show you all of them. But some that are most common one and the most relatable for UX researcher are the response and courtesy bias, in which it means that sometimes when you interview your user, you may not get the absolute truth, either because they answering thinking that you want to hear a particular response and they give you that, or because they don't want to hurt your feeling. So that's a response and courtesy. The halo and horn effects are the opposite of each other. And that means, for example, if you really like a person for whatever reason, then you may discount the negative aspect and focus just on the positive and therefore believe or trust them more. And the horn is the opposite. If you don't like somebody, it doesn't matter really what they say, you probably would not believe it. The IKEA effect means that we usually value things we built ourselves. So if you put a little bit of effort, and that goes also in design and website, if you put a little bit of effort, it actually is more valuable to us. And the endowment effect is similar to the fact that anything we own, we value more, even if we haven't made it, but if we own it, it's considered more valuable than the same exact thing that somebody else owns. Now, remember, those are all unconscious biases. That means if you think about it, obviously it doesn't make sense, right? You should you should judge people for what they were, not if you like them or not. But this is what happened. And there's another bias that's really important for user research to understand, which is temporal discounting. Temporal discounting is basically means that we cannot really think about the future because we value immediate gains over future gains, which is why people, for example, don't save as much for retirement as they should. And the reason being is that when we think about ourselves in the future, we consider that person a stranger. They had actually a 2009 MRI study, which was really interesting, that showed that when we think about us in the future, we have the same reaction in our brain than when we think about a complete stranger. So it's very difficult to create that connection with our future self, which is why in research, you should never ask, what would you do in this situation? Or what do you think you would do? Because you simply don't know. Future you is a complete stranger. Now, one other thing is important to remember is that you're not immune to biases. In fact, there is a bias called the bias blind spot, in which people think that, oh, everybody else is affected by biases, but not me. Even people that spend their life studying biases, they're still affected. They may be aware of it, but they're still affected of it. Now, survivorship biases is another really important bias for researcher, because that means that is a little bit the idea of the winner write history, right? So we obviously, if we send a survey, we only have a few people participating. Those are the people who's going to give you the answer. Doesn't mean it's necessarily representative. The fundamental attribution is another really important one, because that means if, let's say I'm late to a meeting, I will feel that is because there was traffic or construction, that's why I'm late. But if my colleague is late, it's much more likely that I think that is a character flaw, as in, oh, see, he's always late. Obviously, it's his fault. Confirmation bias, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. That means that you're only trying to find answers that match with what you already believe, and you cannot discount anything that's different. And the other two are really, really important when you asking question to your user, because the order in which the question are posed can actually change the answer. So a lot of time is helpful to change the order between participants, so that, let's say you have 5 questions, don't always ask them in the same order, because sometimes the previous question may influence the question that follow. In anchoring, simply said that anytime we make a judgment, we compare it to something. So whatever it shows up in our brain as an anchor, quote unquote, that's what we compare it. So again, it's very difficult to trying to be as neutral as possible so you don't create those comparisons. And it's also important to remember that technology is not immune by biases because it's being created by humans. So don't think about, oh, well, an algorithm came up with this question, they're probably free of biases, because that's not necessarily true. And probably the most difficult bias to be careful from is the framing effect. The framing effect is basically telling you how powerful words are. It's not just what you say, but how you say it. If you have children, you probably know that if you're trying to tell a toddler, 1, 2-year-old, not to wear a flamingo costume to school, guess what the answer is? There's no way. They're not going to do it. They want to wear a flamingo costume, they're going to wear a flamingo costume, right? But if instead of telling them, don't do that, you offer them 2 different options of clothing and neither one of them is a flamingo costume, you have a lot more chance to be successful and convince your toddler to wear something else to school. Now, why is that matters? Obviously, you're not going to interview in toddlers, but it matters because the way you phrase a question can heavily influence the answer. And not just in a question of being, biased in the sense that they understand what answer you want. Even word that seems not important can make a big difference. There was a very famous study in 1974 in which 2 groups of participants were showing the same exact video of a small fender bender between 2 cars. But one group was asked by the scientists about how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. The other group were asked about how fast were the cars going when they smash each other. Now, remember, that was exactly the same video that both groups saw, but the answers were drastically different. The group that received the question with the word smash in it, they estimated much higher speed than the people that actually got the word hit. So it's very, very difficult trying to be as neutral as possible. Now, you probably learned that you should never ask, how do you like whatever? You should always say, how do you feel about it? So you don't kind of influence them to say, yes, I like it. Or is the updated design better than the old design? Once again, that shows your preference for Y versus X. Same as how much, oh, sorry, I repeated twice. And this is the last one, is actually one that I got taught when I start teaching. When somebody asks you a question and it's very obvious they didn't understand what you said, instead of saying, no, you didn't understand me, you could probably try to say, I did not express myself properly. Let me rephrase it, which may or may not be true, but it definitely takes down defenses. So really, really pay attention to the wording that you use for your questions. Another thing our brain does to make quick decision is a heuristic approach. Heuristic approach is basically a rule of thumb, is an approach to solving problems that may not be absolutely perfect, but is good enough for immediate short-term goal. So once again, we can't spend half an hour for every decision we encounter in a day. So sometimes we have kind of a heuristic approach. So it's a little bit like if you ever heard it, once bitten, twice shy. So if you ever pet a dog or a tortoise and you got bitten, probably next time you're going to think about twice. Now, does that mean that the next dog that you're going to see going to bite you? Probably not, but it doesn't hurt to be careful, right? So this is kind of a heuristic approach. And again, most of the time it works perfectly for what we need, okay? The final thing our brain does to kind of make quick decision is creating mental models. Mental models is ideas that we have about ourselves, other people, the world, technology, anything. Now, it's interesting because mental models are not based on reality necessarily. They're based usually on the intuitive perception and on the experiences. So that means my mental models for certain things will be very different than yours. For example, if I would ask you, how do you drive a car? Depending in which part of the world you are, your answer will be very different. If you live in a country where the majority of the car are automatic, you would have a very different answer than if you live in a country where the majority of the cars are actual manual. So I personally live in a country that have most cars are automatic, but I do drive manual. So my mental model about how to drive a car is still very different from my neighbor, even though we're next to each other. Okay, so I love this comic because I think he explained really well the difference between what a designer thinks, the mental model designer, and the user. So for a designer, of course, you create your beautiful maps, and especially if you're a UX or interaction design, you create your sign maps and your screen flows and everything else. You do research and trying to understand what the user does, and then you create this beautiful interface. But what the user does is simply interprets whatever they know. If they're used to Google, they will compare everything they see to Google and expect to work the same, expect any search engine to work like Google. If they're used to using a Mac, they will have trouble using a PC because they're different mental models. So you need to remember that it's very important to trying to find out what those mental models are. And this is why when usability testing is so important, and asking your customer to think out loud, because that will give you an insight of what they expecting. So now that you kind of have a little bit of an idea about some of the principles in psychology that's so important, how do you apply? Why would they be so important for user research? Well, I believe that psychology actually supercharge your research. Now, for a very, very important reason. So there's a great book by Nate Andorsky called Decoding the Why that distinguish different data that you get during a user interview or usability testing. The first type of data is the say data. So basically is whatever the user tells you. It could be answer to question, it could be, again, performing tasks, maybe quotes, anything, right? That would be the say data, whatever the user do. We all know that what the users say is not necessarily what the user do, and that's what the do data. So you could look at what they're actually doing, even if it's in contrast what they say, or you could look at the analytics and see any kind of data regarding your app or your website. And they're both really good. So we're talking about basically qualitative research and quantitative research. But one crucial piece which psychology can help you with is the why data, because you need to understand the real motivation behind user behavior. And honestly, a lot of the time, your user don't know the real motivation. So it's up to you understanding psychology and how the human brain works to interpret what they say and what they do to kind of grab and understand the why data. And this is a real game changer because you open a whole world of opportunity. So it will be something that is very, very helpful. So, another famous UX researcher wrote a pretty cool book called Think Like a UX Researcher. Davis Travis and Philip Hodgson break down the 4 most important things you need to understand when you're doing UX research as informed by psychology. Obviously, the first one, the user don't think, act, or feel like you. And you probably already know that. You probably learn in your first time you even approach UX that user are not you. So, but the second thing is what we just mentioned, the why, because user don't have good insight into the reason for their action. And you are the one that needs to find out. You also need to study their behavior, analyze it, compare what you know about the human brain so that you can predict their future behavior. Remember, people don't know what they're going to do in the future. So asking them is really not going to give you a lot of valuable data. But looking at your past behavior will give you a much better representation of what people are going to do in the future. And finally, the context, because you need to understand that personality is important, demographics are important, but the context in which a situation happened is possibly even more important. If you think about yourself, I'm sure you noticed before that you act differently in different contexts. At the very least, if you talk to a child or an adult, you will use different words to express the same ideas, right? So it's important you understand that context and trying to find out as much as possible about it. And finally, you want to remember that humans are ruled by emotion, and that means you and your users. So you need to obviously be very careful with your own emotion, but you also need to understand that emotion would always override reason. I would say 99% of the time, if not 100%. And emotion, any response you get, like a spontaneous response from your user, will be naturally emotion. It will actually, it's not something they rehearse, hopefully. And that means also that words, images, and environment can influence the person you're interviewing as well as you. Now, depending how you feel about, cats and butterflies, when you saw this picture, you definitely felt something. Hopefully something like, oh, this is cute. But if you hate cats, probably you have a different reaction. But that explains why something as simple as a little kitty with a butterfly, it will be able to influence how you feel, even if maybe for a short time. And that also means the first impression forms, that you have to understand the first impression forming a 1/20th of a second. So why that's matter? Well, because if when you walk in the room to interview your user, if for whatever reason they have a bad impression, it will be really difficult to build a rapport with them. Now, obviously, you can't control it, right? So the first 20th of a second that you saw me or heard me talk, you already made an impression on me, about me. So hopefully a positive one, but that will influence everything else I say. So this is why you should take a lot of care to make sure that the environment, your conversation, or everything put the user at ease as much as possible, because it's very difficult to override your first impression. Now, think about it. When we're thinking about emotion, now looking at this picture of a shark, you definitely have some kind of response, emotional response, right? Most likely not a pleasant one. And in fact, most people are really, really scared of sharks and shark attacks. We all probably watch, the shark movies or Sharknado or, Jaws or any other movie. So a lot of us is really, really scared of sharks. However, if you rationally look at the number of people that die every year in a shark attack that was not provoked, so you didn't go in and bother the shark, that number globally is 5. A total of 5 people die every year of a shark attack. Now, I'm not saying it's fun. I feel bad for those 5 people, but you understand with, almost 8 billion people, 5 people a year, really not that much. However, there's still this really big irrational fear of shark. On the other hand, if I'm telling you, hey, come over in the car with me, you probably would not think about twice as long as you know me, right? Maybe your friends or your family. And if you rationally think about it, going in a car is a lot more dangerous than swimming and being eaten by a shark. In fact, in the United States alone, I think in 2021, which is one of the latest statistics I could find, about 41,000 people died in a car accident. So obviously, rationally, you should be terrified to be on a car because it's so common to die. In fact, if you're scared of flying, I know that a lot of people probably told you by the time you get to the airport, you already passed the most dangerous part of your trip, because driving is way more dangerous than airplanes. So that shows you how emotion rules us, even though they may not be 100% rational. So because of that, because emotions are so strong, it can really, really influence what people are thinking. It's important to be trauma informed when you're doing a usability interview or user research. So you need to bring a whole new level of empathy. So what does that mean? First of all, what is trauma? Now, one thing is important to understand about trauma is that it is an emotional response. Trauma is not an event. It's not a series of events. It's an emotional response to an event, which means that situation can be traumatic for some people and not traumatic at all for other people. So you cannot have assumption about, oh, this is definitely going to be traumatic. So what does that have to do with design or research? Well, if you're taking the time to consider how trauma or exclusion or inequality affect user experiences, then you're going to be able to create a more inclusive design, a more inclusive service, and even a better environment to conduct interviews. So, but how do you know if somebody's experienced trauma? Well, you can't. You really can't unless they physically tell you, right? And you don't necessarily want to ask it, are you experiencing trauma? So what you wanted to consider, that make an assumption that anybody that you encounter or you interview could have experienced or be experiencing trauma. A little bit back on the better safe than sorry, okay? And the reason why this is important is because you can create great risk to our user by obviously re-traumatizing them, because we are in a position of power in comparison to them. Even though you don't feel like it, you are in a higher power position compared to the person you're interviewing. And because we have a very strong ability to influence how the conversation is going to go. So now, by the way, trauma informed also means you have to take care of yourself, because sometimes interview can bring up trauma in you as well. So, but this is pretty simple things to do. And I like this quote to say that, trauma informed, simply recognize that trauma can have a huge impact and understand the needs or create environments for healing and recovery, rather than environment situation that can inadvertently re-traumatize. Nobody decide, oh, I'm going to be traumatized my user today, but it could happen. So that means you have to pay attention to words, you pay attention also to environment. I like those six kind of rules, quote unquote. Those were posted by Kay Avery, a great person to follow if you're interested in trauma-informed design. So, but the number one thing is make sure that there is physical, psychological, and emotional safety. So again, from the environment, the way the place is situated, like the way you sit in a, next to that person, those are really important choices. Make sure that everybody feels really safe. Also be very transparent and inspire trust, because only this way you're gonna have the real answer you're looking for. So that means explain exactly what the test is going to be. And if there is any occasion in which for some reason you can't disclose 100% of your research, make sure you debrief afterwards and give the chance to your user to withdraw their consent if possible. Also, make sure that, think about how participants can support each other. If possible, sometimes it may be helpful to go to their place versus have them come to a lab, which can feel very, alien. Make sure that you understand that you wanted to create a collaboration in the interview is something mutual, like a good conversation is not you telling them what to do. And that will give them empowerment, voice, and choice. Make sure that they can decide when to take breaks, if they need breaks, and if you want to stop at any time. And finally, be aware of cultural, historical, and gender issue. Obviously, you want to realize that everybody have different personality, as in obviously what is called like intersectionality. So I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I am an immigrant, I'm Italian, I'm American, I'm a teacher, I'm a student. So there's a lot of different pieces that kind of interact with each other. It's important to try as much as you can to include all of those identity, which also means make sure that your team ideally has nice diversity as well, so that you could offer that kind of resonance to your user. And then finally, you want to talk about some of the ethical issues, because psychology is a superpower, and understanding how people react and predict how they're going to react because you're aware of biases or heuristic is very, very powerful. And it can allow you to actually get better results for your customer and create better apps and create better experiences. Is also very easy that it kind of slips into manipulation. So now there is no code of ethic in design, but there are a lot of rules that I think most researcher follows. And especially if you come from academia, you are kind of bound or at least familiar with some of those rules. So number one, transparency and informed consent. And just like I mentioned before, if it's not possible to be completely transparent at the beginning of the interview because it may bias the results, make sure you debrief right after. Then, of course, privacy, confidentiality, data protection. Only ask what you really need. You don't need to have every possible demographic question in your survey. Just ask what you need. Make sure that obviously no harm is done. Be neutral and trying to be honest and accurate when you interpret the result. Remember, we are talking about the confirmation bias, so don't just discount, data that doesn't match with your hypothesis. Make sure you accept all of it. And as you're probably familiar, if you're following a little bit the scientific world, there is a huge problem of not being able to replicate some result or data being forged and so on. So, and the Nielsen Norma group says it best that UX research ethic is simply the careful consideration of the rights, well-being, and dignity of people involved in research activities. It's pretty straightforward, right? Basically, be a real good person. That's kind of what it is. Now, this is a perfect example what I say that is really not being transparent or being ethical in your design. Now, this is just a design, of course, that wasn't necessarily a survey or anything like that. But why is this creating a problem? Why is this not the best way to do? So this was a pop-up box that come up when I'm trying to cancel an account to a service that I had. So I don't have a problem with them trying to convince me to stay or ask me, do you really want to cancel your account? That's okay. What I have problem with is everything that comes after. So before you can cancel the subscription, you have to check those 3 boxes. Before you can check those 3 boxes, you have to actually read what they're saying. And again, knowing psychology, you can tell that they're trying in any possible way to make you feel like you're losing something, because nobody likes to lose, right? That's another one of our bias called loss aversion. We do not want to lose. So they're trying to remind you, hey, you're gonna lose all this stuff. Everything will stop functioning, but they don't stop there. You have to acknowledge that your account is inactive, your domain will be removed, all the asset, landing page, and lead will stop functioning. I understand that you can reactivate your account. I understand that the price is likely to increase in the future, and I may not be able to rejoin. So this is require a huge amount of effort on the user that just want to cancel their subscription. And if you don't check those boxes, you're not going to be able to cancel. This is why I'm saying it's definitely an unethical way to deal with this kind of situation. And this is obviously intentional. This is done on purpose to take advantage of those biases, right? But it can also be not intentional. So, for example, this is a real confidentiality form that I did for usability testing. So hopefully I deleted all the name of the company made me do it, but I had to read those 3 pages and I had to put in my signature and my initial before I could be doing the usability testing. Now, informed consent is super important. You should have it, but look at just 3 pages of informed consent to participate to a usability study. That's insane. And I just kind of pull out those 2 quotes, because in my opinion, they were particularly annoying. So just say, by participating in the study, you are over 18, participated, will not violate any agreement with a third party, create a conflict of interest, your participation completely voluntary. You may choose to withdraw at any time. You also decline to answer. The researcher have the right to end the study. So it takes a lot of effort for me to go through it, all the document, right? 3 pages to agree to do a usability study. So why is that a problem? Well, remember how we said that system 2 is a lot of effort. So if I have to read and think about all those things, that's a lot of effort. This mental effort is called cognitive load. So it's the amount of mental resources required to understand and complete a task, right? When your brain get overloaded, overstimulated, overwhelmed, you run out basically of the resources. So you don't have enough resource to deal with it. That's when you're in cognitive overload. And this is what those two examples I just showed you will take you to. You would just think about it way too much for something that really shouldn't take that much effort. Okay. And cognitive overload is a really big problem. It's a problem in design, but it could be a problem, as we saw, even in a usability study. Now, why? Because when you're in cognitive overload, beside the fact that you feel bad, you generate a lack of trust. So, which means that if somebody's different, don't trust you, they may not give you the right answer. You get frustrated. So any task that you ask for may feel like a chore. They may feel overwhelmed. So that means they have a ton of vision and limited creative thinking. And so they're not going to be able to answer the question or do the task as well as they could have. And they may be really defensive. So they may not be open to express the real feeling because they're thinking there's something behind it. When you have to sign a 3-page consent contract, you feel like there's something hidden there. They're not telling you everything. So a couple of more ethical dilemma to conclude. Those were actually from Nielsen Norman, but I really, really enjoyed that. So again, you're gonna need to be careful. It's kind of like a tightrope walking between balancing honest disclosure with study guide, study goals, like we mentioned before. Also be careful if you have to interview vulnerable groups, they cannot necessarily consent. And we're talking about minor for sure, but also other vulnerable groups. Maybe you're talking with somebody that is not speaking the language and you're using a translator. You want to make sure that there is somebody that can help and that can, somebody trusted that can help the person. Also, be very careful about sensitive personal information. So if you have to collect some very personal information, especially if it may lead to recognize who the person is, just use it for what you need it and then immediately remove it. And definitely don't share it unless unless it's the people in your team. And finally, another ethical dilemma, it would be how you keep confidentiality to a small group. So imagine that you're only interviewing like 5 people in a department in a company. It's a little bit difficult not, to be completely anonymous when the group is so small. And I can tell you as a teacher, every semester we have, evaluation sheets. And if the class is really small, it is not as difficult to figure it out who wrote what comment. Obviously, the way to fix that in the educational system is that you don't see the evaluation until after you deliver your final grade, so that you cannot even unconsciously be obviously influenced. So, but if that's the case, you probably don't want to promise confidentiality. Obviously, you will just say, like, we're not going to necessarily ask you for your name, but keep in mind it's a small group, so some things can be inferred. And of course, participants should always allow to withdraw. So in summary, I want to remind you that I believe that a focus on humans and humanity means a focus on human psychology. That's why psychology is so important. Sorry, I forgot to change this, but the human psychology will allow you to supercharge your research. And we also need to help our user being trauma informed by being trauma informed to support them and to gain their trust. And finally, because ethic gives us so much power, also gonna give us responsibility. So we should use it only for good, ideally, and not for unethical purposes, even though a lot of people do. All right, and with that, what question do you have?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tatiana. That was great.
Oh, you're welcome. So let me stop sharing so that if there is any, actually I can show you my contact info. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
So
We
in
got
case you want to reach out to me, feel free to reach out. Obviously, this is just a scratching kind of the surface. So I want to just give you kind of an introduction. I feel that psychology is fascinating. And honestly, I'm surprised that it's not taught in all design schools because you are designed for people. So, but I just want to make sure I give you kind of a brief overview, hopefully get you interested to learn more. And I want to give you plenty time to ask questions as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And we'll be posting your slides and then the recording of this as well as you on
Yes.
YouTube, if people want to reference it later as well.
Mhm.
So yeah, we documented some questions that people
Oh,
put in the
great.
chat, and you guys can continue putting items in the chat as well as we continue. I'll just start off with a few that people asked.
Mhm.
First being about bias in data, especially when you're conducting analysis. So
Yes.
how can you advise to avoid bias in the analysis?
Well, I mean, I'm not an academic and I'm not a quantitative researcher, but what I can recommend you is to do the double bind test. So that means like the person collecting data should not be the same person analyzing the data. So that already helps a little bit to keep that separation so that nobody really know what they were trying to find out. They can just be a little bit more objective in their statement. And if possible, at all time, I always recommend to record the session. Even if the participant does not want it to be recorded in the face, maybe they agree to be recorded from the back so you don't see who they are, but you can still hear their answer, and then share that with a colleague or two, depending on kind of how it's possible, because then there are three different people that have different biases. So it will be easier to kind of neutralize each other. So I think
Cool.
that's would be kind of a way to do it.
Cool. And just as a personal follow-up, I know you kind of talked about consent. Is there anything important in terms of consent if you're sharing those results with
Yes,
stakeholders or?
of course. Of course, yeah. Always ask for consent at any point in time, and also make sure that they can change their idea about consent. So if you ask a question they don't feel comfortable with, they can always say, no, I don't want to answer, or I don't want to be recorded, or whatever that is. So yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Great. And then kind of going and through your discussion of the trauma-informed
Mhm,
research,
mhm.
in terms of a safe environment, how can we make sure that the environment is safe when we're preparing for those research sessions, both for ourselves and for our participants?
Well, I think obviously it's gonna change from situation to situation because different people have different issues or different trauma. The first thing I always recommend is trying to make the environment as quote unquote friendly as possible, meaning there is like, a round table or something that looks like a conversation versus a test. So that can be helpful. Now, if you're talking about, gender or gender identity or sexuality, ideally would be to get people that have a diverse background to perform some of those interviews so that they can see somebody that looks like them or that had similar experience. Um, that's always very helpful. Also, at the beginning of the interview session is always good, instead of just starting in with a question, to break the ice a little bit and trying to find anything that could be common. You're probably gonna have an idea who you're interviewing, maybe not in detail, but you probably have their age and a few basic information, trying to see if you can find something in common, because that's one other reason that people like other people they have something in common with. So if you
Awesome.
can find a similarity between them in any aspect, doesn't have to be everything the same, but like I say, hey, I see that you have two young children. I have a child too. So just immediately kind of get that little thing is like, oh, okay, maybe you understand better what it means to be a mom, or have a toddler that want to wear a flamingo costume to school. So by the way, that was not I have a son, so it's never happened to me, but similar situation. I just really like the picture. That's
It's a good picture for sure.
right.
And someone else, just as a follow-up, asked kind of, you talked about kind of that pairing, getting to know someone before you
Mhm.
kind of dive into the nitty-gritty with your research session. But how long do you recommend kind of trying to get to know someone or find that relatable thing you can talk about before you?
I mean, obviously depends, but I would say about maybe like 10 minutes if you have the time. And again, it needs to, I will recommend to make it sounds like an actual conversation, because I feel that, and I still go and do research tests if I can kind of make it not lie about it, but like if I can get in, because I'm interested to see what other people do. And sometimes people just like jump right in. Okay, you're here to do this, then let's just do that. Right. So, and that's really abrupt, even for, me, and I know what I'm doing, but like I've done it a million times, so I know. But I think it's always better to create a connection with the person that you're with, and like a genuine connection. So, obviously, get inspired, but don't plan it necessarily, trying to be as spontaneous as possible and find something, I think.
Awesome.
Mhm.
And this is kind of a question, but following up, do you, again,
Yeah.
kind of based in remote research, but then also in-person research,
Mhm.
do you have any recommendations, I guess, in terms of how that might differ in terms of making that connection or just kind of that
Yes.
trauma-based research in general?
Yeah. I mean, I feel that obviously in person, I'm kind of old fashioned that way. I still feel that in person, you can get a better connection in general, just because they're two human beings in the same room. And you can even get, if you're in person, you can even get a chance like, oh my gosh, I really love your shoes. Where do you get your shoes? Or, whatever. So things like this is much easier to happen in person, then you can do that, then you can do on video. But even on video, it happened to me before. There's like, I can look at, I don't know if that's your real house or not, but I can see there is an Oguchi table in the background and a very cool like Danish lamp. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love this type of furniture too. And again, it's not always possible, but you can always try to find that connection. So is that your real house, or is it?
It is.
I'm so
Yes.
jealous. I love the Noguchi. So
So yeah.
mhm. Yes, yes. So
That makes sense. Awesome. Very cool. Thank you.
mhm.
And then kind of going back to that informed consent topic,
Yes.
one participant in the chat brought up kind of the levels of consent. So the example they gave was if you created some sort of research panel or
Okay.
kind of a pool of researchers that you can pull from and gather informed consent from them when they signed up for that panel. Kind of at what levels do you need to collect informed consent? Like if they sign up, are they good to go for the rest of those sessions, or should you kind of
Well,
inform them?
depends on what is in the sign up for. Like, as long as you're very aware of what you're going to get into. So, if I'm going for, for a testing panel, whatever that is, just tell me what it is, how long it's gonna take, what kind of information you're trying to gather, what is the purpose. Once you do that, then you should be okay, unless you kind of spring something else on me. So the idea of the informed consent is say, okay, you're going to be here for this. This is going to be your incentive. This is going to be, if he's okay with you, we'll record. This is the kind of information we're getting. This is who we're sharing it with, and so on.
Cool. Makes sense. Awesome. And then just kind of more generic.
Oh, I think I lost you.
We might have lost her, but let's see. We can maybe keep going with the questions. I've got them up
Right.
until she gets back.
Okay, I think somebody also raised a hand, I think. Can't really see, but
Awesome. Would you mind just putting your question in the chat and we will get to it? We've got a bunch of other ones here as well. I think there were a lot of questions
okay.
around resources and education and like how can I learn more about UX psychology and what degree or education do I need to be updated in this?
Okay. I mean, obviously depends what, like, UX psychology is pretty wide, as in it's not as known here, but it's basically the marriage between design, UX, and psychognitive and social and behavioral psychology. Those are mainly the three applied psychology. They're really helpful. And I would say if you had to pick one, maybe, I don't know, all three of them are really important, like cognitive, social, and behavioral are really, really important. I know that there are some courses in like behavioral design that give you kind of a sprinkling. In my case, obviously, I actually went to school and I got a degree in psychology. So it obviously is kind of full, but it's not necessary. If you're really interested in the topic, you can find a lot of like books and resources. And I definitely could compile like a list of some really cool books that I read about psychology. There's quite a few that they are kind of bridging the gap between psychology and design or research. So, and again, I'm surprised that it's not more common in schools. I think it should be a mandatory class. I mean, some classes have just a general psychology, but it should be really focused on design psychology, I think. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a psychology major myself, so having all of that background has been really helpful in my
right,
design and research career. So I can definitely speak to that firsthand.
right.
Um, you mentioned you could compile a couple book recommendations, so that did come
Yes,
up. Does any one or two books come to mind
yes.
right now that we
Oh
can
yeah,
share with
oh
folks?
yeah, always. So I have three right here, which I don't get paid to advertise, by the way. I just really like them. So the probably the classic one is the one from Susan Wainshank, 100 Things Every Designer Need to Know About People. See, I don't know. Can you see it?
Yes, love that.
Right. So this is really good because, in fact, I used to have it as a mandated textbook for my UX student because it goes into like basically summarize all the psychology research and how it applies to design. So that's a really good one. If you want to understand more how the brain works, this is another really good one called Designing with the Mind in Mind by Jeff Johnson. I don't know if you can let me know if you
Awesome.
did as
Yeah.
well. So that's a really good one. And then if you're more interested in behavioral change, there is a couple of other books that are really, really good, but they're very focused on behavioral design and creating change and making experiments. So, and those would be something like either Design for How People Think and Designing for Behavioral Change. So those I would say like my favorite books. But like I said, the last two are very focused on behavioral change. So,
Awesome.
so if you're interested on that, so
I will definitely, I'll find the links for those and share them in the chat and kick it back over to Emily, who got kicked off to answer or to ask the rest of the questions.
okay, great, thank you.
Sorry about that. I think I dropped mid-sentence.
That's okay. That's all right. It happens. It happens.
Cool. So we have time for a few more questions. I have one surrounding framing and kind of the order of questions.
Yeah.
So I also have a psychology background in behavior analysis. So I love the concept of framing and the topic of framing. You kind of discuss framing in terms of framing questions differently and sometimes come out with different outcomes, but then
Yes.
also the order of questions.
Right.
You know, that's
Correct.
mix those up within sessions.
Yes.
Do you think kind of combining those methods is either helpful or maybe not so helpful in terms of gathering?
100%. I mean, as I say, I think the most difficult one is finding the right words. The framing, that is because you want to be very neutral, and that's very difficult to do. Because remember, people try to please you and to say what, you know, not on purpose, but like they want to be nice people, they want to help you. So it's very, very different, very, very different to find a very neutral word as far as framing. But yes, I like, if possible, to change the order of questions as much as possible, because once again, you never know what brought in that answer. And that goes also for usability testing. When you're actually testing prototypes, I always recommend to change the order, because sometimes, you know, you do one task and then while you're doing that, you kind of glimpse the answer for the next task. So it's kind of nice to switch the order so that you can really hopefully have a really good neutral answer. So, but yeah, for sure. And obviously you want to be careful with framing, that you don't frame it to get the kind of answer you want. So how
Cool.
much do you like me now, you know?
That makes sense. Thank you. And
Mhm.
we actually had a follow-up too from
Okay.
someone in the chat regarding sorry, I lost it. Oh, avoiding bias, which was a
Yes.
pretty good question.
Mhm.
They asked if you're on a team of either you're the only researcher or a team of two researchers who are maybe kind of spread thin, how you avoid that kind of bias if someone else.
I would say I would say step number one is to be aware which biases do you have. This is really difficult, obviously, like any self-introspection, but the more aware you are of your biases, the easier it will be for you to spot it. If it's like, oh yeah, I'm thinking that because, you know, and remember, nobody's perfect. Nobody's going to be absolutely 100% unbiased. Again, there's a lot of writing on that topic of like how to recognize your own unconscious biases and Generally, you could be I would start with the basic stuff. Like, do you have any biases towards the big topic, like ethnicity, religion, politics, those kind of things, because usually those are things that is easy to have biases. And it's a long process as you go through it. Just try as much as possible. If you're not sure, I'm sure you can have a colleague, even if it's not a researcher, and you can ask them. It's like, and the other thing is, that's why I like the recording, because once you have a recording, you're not writing what you think you heard. You have exactly what you heard. So trying to be as literal as possible. Don't interpret anything. Just write straight, or record, or whatever way you take notes when you interview. Try not to make any kind of analysis yet. Just write it. Even if you feel like it makes no sense, just write it or record it or whatever. So at least that, this is the actual content they said. You may still get misunderstanding, but it should be easier.
Awesome. Great.
Somebody was asking, how would you answer a stakeholder about what is a good number to manage biases? I mean, I would say 2 to 3 is enough. Like, talking about researchers, like 2, 3 researcher, I think is fine, because again, each one gonna have their own bias. And so, the chances that let me take it back. Depends whether, if the researcher are identical, that the same ethnicity, same age, same gender, same everything, that would be harder to be unbiased. Diversity is always the answer. If you have multiple people from different background, it definitely helps to have different perspective. Yeah, which is kind of the problem with AI right now. That is one group of people feeding all those algorithms. So that's kind of one of them. Okay. How can we use AI to reduce our biases? Oof. I don't think you can right now. I don't think, if anything, I think AI right now is amplifying biases. And you just have to do a few searches in Midjourney or DALL-E. Search for things like, somebody did an experiment to search for like nurse, doctor, janitor, autism, or whatever. And it was sad, the result they come up. So nurses, they were all women, generally white women. Doctor were all white men. CEO were all older men, older white men. Janitor were usually people of color. I mean, I would not trust AI to get rid of the biases, because AI, in my opinion, amplify biases. It doesn't take them away, because they're made by humans. They didn't make themselves. So obviously humans have biases. So, but yeah. One thing somebody asks, I don't know if you in this chat, but sometimes I ask, is when you get the recording, if you can save the chat and share it, because I know there are some links and things like that.
So
yeah, and I mean, again, feel free to connect with me. Please, if you do, tell me why you're connecting with me, because at least I know where you know me from, and I'll be happy to trying to give you some more resources. I'm working on a course, but that may take a while, but I'll let you guys know what I do on like UX psychology and stuff. So I'll let you know, but it's still early, but yes.
Cool.
Great.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much. Let's give Tiziana a big round of applause.
Of course, that was fun. Thank you. That was really good. So
awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you so much. So with that, we will open this up, as I've said, for our happy hour. So this portion, it's just kind of a raise your hand and ask a question type of situation. You can talk about our event today, or just any kind of perspective that you have regarding UX research, strategy, design, any of those topics. So I'll give you guys the floor. Does anyone have any thoughts about today's topic, how it applies to their current work, projects you've worked on, or just kind of broader questions that brought up? So we have a hand raised.
Yeah. Do you want digital or?
Yeah, digital works. That works. Oh, Jennifer, I see you too. Yeah. Yeah, raise a digital hand and then, all right. So I'll just kind of go down the line.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, I had a question about just a little bit about myself. I'm a beginner UX researcher. I work at a fintech, and I and my mentor, she has a lot of UX research experience. We are set on a purpose of helping people gain financial well-being. This I anticipate that this comes at odds with some of the business outcomes that are favored by higher ups. I'm wondering, how do we develop buy-in from higher management, like marrying up the user experience with the business outcomes that we're looking for?
That's a great question. I'll open it up to the group. If anyone has an answer, feel free to unmute yourself. If not, I can give my thoughts. Anyone want to take a stab at answering?
I'm happy to go first if no one else is going to go. I think one thing that is super important with that is making sure that this is something that the higher ups actually want. And so doing UX research inside of your company and figuring out what's important to the higher ups in your company, and then if and how you can tie those back to the things that you are trying to do or that you want to accomplish. Because if we don't understand our users, which in this case is the business leaders, we're not going to be able to help them like we would, just like we're trying to do with UX research generally.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I think my kind of thought too is after we understand them, then we're able, as Susie and I kind of talked about framing today, we're able to frame our work and its importance kind of from into their perspective and goals as well. So anyone else have a thought before we move on? I think
I echo what you both said. I think what Parker just said was fantastic. So I would say stakeholder interviews at the very start, or creating some kind of workshop where the key stakeholders are in the room, aligning everyone on the objectives. If you can get smart objectives out of the session, fantastic. And just try and find out, what those business outcomes that they are looking to achieve, but then also tempering it by saying, we also need to be looking at what our customer base is looking for. And I'm trying to go with this, the value of providing that financial stability, that financial education you're giving to the customers, that's going to create a lot of trust with that customer base, a lot of empathy. They're going to have buy-in to the organization, which, when you've got happy customers, they're obviously going to want to stay with you and start using your products and services.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I saw we had a few other. Jennifer, I saw your hand was maybe raised.
Hi, I have a general just question. I'm looking for work, but I've been seeing just crazy responses to UX role applicants. And I'm assuming there's lots and lots of us out there looking right now. And I just was wondering if other people have been experiencing the same thing. That makes me think that somebody's spamming these roles because there are hundreds of applications all of a sudden. And then my second part of my question, I see lots of people nodding their heads. My second part of the question was, in the last week or two, I've been noticing that companies have been sending me personality profiles before I even talk to anyone. Have other people been experiencing that? And to me, that seems like that's presupposing bias right off the bat, because it's made me think a lot about surveys, right? You do a survey for a personality and it's forcing you to make a decision about your personality in two questions, or not two questions, aspects of your personality within two questions, right? There might be 30 questions in the set. It seems like that's creating a bias before you ever have an interview. And I was wondering what people's thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think I definitely relate to both of those things. But just as a plug, we had 2 previous events with Hangzhou and also Amy Santee with UXRS. And so I would definitely check those out. They had a lot of some hot takes, I would say, in terms of the current job market and hiring process. But those are definitely, I found them very helpful in terms of their kind of insights and advice and tips for how to navigate those situations. But I'll open it up for others too if they want to talk about their experiences as well.
It's okay.
Yeah, very similar to United Kingdom as well, where I'm from. I've been going to job interviews at the moment for my next contract, and permanent work. There is a huge amount of competition. There seems to be a real sort of rise of people from different backgrounds, user experience, UX, UI, or user research, all seem to be going for these roles. I've not come across anything which has given me a personality behavioral profile, anything like that up front. I'd be on the back foot if that happened. But what I have found is there's a lot of emphasis on showing your worth before you start the job. It's not just about having behavioral set interview questions. You seem to have that in a first stage interview, and then it seems to be followed up with a second stage. I've been finding where you're set some homework, you have to do a task, which can be really tough if you're putting lots of applications out. You know, I've had a couple where, you know, one I've had to design a complete user research plan for a side of their one of their products that the organization was looking at. And then in another, I had to show how I would run. I had a choice. I could either role play running a workshop of how I would engage with stakeholders to start off with in a discovery, or put together a presentation and just talk through what I would do. And I opted for the latter just because the amount of participants there would have been, interviewers that would have been engaged in it. But yeah, a huge amount of effort going into these things. I got down to the last two people in both instances, and didn't quite get over the line. But that mental effort and all that hard time of work being put in, it's a tough market at the moment.
Yeah, I'll second that from the US side. I'll just repeat what Hang has said, and what I've observed is during the pandemic, there was obviously a huge hiring surge. There were tens of thousands of design roles and many thousand research roles, and it's down to maybe a tenth of what it was since before the pandemic. And you also have the collision of two forces of applicants coming in from both sides of the market. You have a lot of senior people that have been let go from tech companies recently in the US, and you have a lot of boot camp graduates who are trying to transition into the role from the bottom side. So you have a lot of applicants hitting every position, and and even during the pandemic, there were very few junior level positions, right? Most people were hiring seniors because they're starting practice, and they need somebody that can take a project from start to finish. So it's very difficult anyway to find a junior role, but especially now with all the competition. My reflection is that if companies are starting to put their assessments up front, that's just a reflection of how many applicants they're getting for a role, right? They're trying to weed them out with something up front where they can do a simple score and say I don't want to look at anybody that doesn't score at least this well on that assessment. And then if you get into the interview process, just like Kevin said, you're more than likely going to be asked for some sort of practical demonstration of your skills, because anybody can fake a portfolio or a resume, and they want to actually see that you can do the work you say you can do, and not just really talk well around the problem. So yeah, you're not alone. Hang in there. It's tough right now, and it's going to even out.
I'm someone that's just starting a journey into the job search, but I'm going to parrot a bunch of things that I've been reading about, in particular in regards to the fact that they're seeing a lot of requests for personality tests, which again, it just seems really weird. But the main question is like, what is it that they're doing with that information? And then it's just like, are they using that information to define the personality that they think is going to best fit that role? And it feels weird, right? It just almost feels like a red flag, and it's weird and freaky and scary. So I'm really worried about that aspect in my own approach to the job hunt. But I would like to mention that if you ever look into like federal government work, they do have a thing where they basically do their best to eliminate any sort of discrimination and bias in the search, because they have rules that say they basically cannot see a picture of you. They can't ask you these like personality type questions. It's all about whether or not you can do the job. But that being said, their whole like application process is its own job. They have their own type of resume and a bunch of rules and questionnaires, and the way that they write the job is just like this massive book, and you just have to know how to read it and how to apply to it, and it's its own, like I said, it's its own job. So sorry for rambling. I do have a question for later, but I don't feel like it's my turn to speak yet. So
Oh yeah, I saw your hand is raised. But yeah, just to wrap this up, I think I agree. The personality test thing is, I think you used the word scary, which I agree. It's intimidating and scary, and it's kind of similar to me if you're talking to a recruiter or a hiring manager who isn't UX based. Sometimes that can also be a barrier. That's kind of similar as well. But no, thanks for everyone for your insights on that. Maria, I see your hand is raised, but Cecile, I did see yours before. So if you're ready to present your question, we'll do Cecilia, and then Maria, I'll get to you next.
you know, I kind of got lost in my thought there, but it was I was going to talk more about the fact that we talked about trauma-informed design and whatnot today, and I remember from a different discussion with a different group, I guess, that apparently when it comes to safety in apps, there's a higher expectation for that in like healthcare and healthcare related, you know, applications and whatnot. So I'm wondering from anyone who's currently working in the UX space, if you feel like there is a higher expectation for you in being, I guess, that kind of trauma informed and aware in your own research.
I think that's a great question. I'll throw it to the group first. If not, I definitely have some thoughts, but I'll see if anyone else wants to take a stab at it first.
Yeah, hi Cecilia. I think it very much depends on the type of role that you're going for. If you are going for a government related role, which is in healthcare, then there are expectations that you have some grounding in psychology and, you know, perhaps some social care experience or healthcare experience, and you're able to provide that safety net and that safe space that Tiziana was talking about in her presentation. With all of those elements, I think that's definitely a requirement for that type of role. I wouldn't say it's for every specific type of role. I think there's lots of government agencies, especially here in the UK, where you wouldn't need that. Yeah, it depends on the type of role you're going for.
Yeah, I agree. I think anytime there's behavior change or behavior modification, the use of psychology, behavioral methods, I think it is the researcher's responsibility to take care and take those ethics into consideration. I might have frozen again, but I'll keep talking just in case. I think it is our responsibility, like Diana was saying, in terms of those ethical considerations and consent considerations, to keep those in mind. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
I'll also say it's kind of related, but not really. So I don't do specific UX work. I do both qualitative and quantitative research work. I'm a research analyst, so we do a lot of market research, user research, product research. But that being said, you'll go in, like I'll go into a study, like say I'm doing IDIs or some bland thing, right? But through the course of that conversation, right? And as we're walking through something, and I think this was touched on during the presenter's deck, stuff will come up, right? Where it's like something where it's sensitive in nature. And when that happens, I think that even though that I'm not necessarily trauma informed, quote unquote, it's taking that situation, having empathy and kind of pausing and saying, hey, you know, are you comfortable moving forward? You know, is this okay to go? Because we're recording our sessions, right? And we obviously get consent beforehand, but I hit the pause button in recognition of that, being like, hey, even though I'm not trauma informed, where it's like it's that kind of empathetic part to that. But also, I think I've also done IDIs for like transitioning fosters. So these are foster kids that are aging out of the system, right? So there's a lot of trauma there. And that is a different mindset going in, right? Because you kind of know already. But it still doesn't change, I guess, how I go about my interviews. Like I try to have that kind of mindset regardless, but at least I'm a little bit more prepared in case that happens.
Sorry, everyone, my Zoom dropped again. But Brooke, it sounded like you had a great answer, and Cecilia, thanks for bringing up that great question. You guys can hear me now, right? Okay, cool. All right, so we'll move on. Maria, I saw your hand was up, so we can move on to your question if you're ready.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and pleasure meeting you all. I had a question regarding today's topic about the trauma. I had never even considered it, and now I'm scared because I would feel horrible re-traumatizing someone during an interview. And I'm not a psychologist. And I feel like it's a really delicate matter. How do you deal it? For me, it's kind of like if you had to address a medical emergency during an interview, how do you prepare for that? Because there are so many traumas, so many triggers that can re-traumatize a person that I have to be careful about, especially in my country. We do a bunch of hand movements, and maybe I'm being a little too paranoid, but I don't know if that might trigger someone. And I feel like today's talk was more of a general overview, which is great because it gives us indicators of, okay, I know there's such a thing as re-traumatizing someone. I may not know exactly how to prepare for it, but at least now I know that I don't know, so I can go and look it up. But I wanted to ask you guys if you guys have ever had to deal with something like that, or if there is any information that you guys can send to me on how to prepare for those cases. And if someone does start to have an episode due to this trauma, how should I handle it and not make it worse? That's my main concern, making it worse.
Just to give you a real world example then. So I've worked in a gaming and betting organization in the past, and I was working on the account side of things, but there was a heavy emphasis on making sure that we had the tools, the processes in place so that we would try and prevent problem gambling, allowing people to self-exclude for a certain amount of time or permanently, all of those types of things. Obviously, as a user researcher conducting interviews, there are cases where the participant might be saying something to you. They may not regard themselves, they're an adult, they've consented to gambling, but they may not realize that what they're talking about is actually indications of problem gambling behavior. So as an organization, as a group of researchers, we had to create protocols. And I think that's a really good thing in any sort of industry or any type of user research that you're going into. Think about some of the cases that could come up and what are your protocols that are going to be put in place to handle those. So, for instance, if someone was describing to me something which I felt heart of heart, this person has got a problem gambling behavior, I'm obviously not going to call them out there and then in the interview. That's an abuse of power, and it's not what they've consented to do this, and they're an adult. But you could have a protocol in place where you bring the interview to a close, because what they're describing, what they're disclosing is probably too much of an overshare, and they possibly need some intervention. So having a protocol of what do you do to end the interview or the research study in an appropriate way, not to alarm them or alert them. And then what protocols have you got in place to be able to get some of the back service staff to check their activity on their accounts? And is it showing us that they are also going into some kind of issue or problem like they were describing? And then they are best placed to be able to follow up with them on a phone call. They do it day in, day out. They hear from people that are calling up and saying, I've spent $1,000 last night on spins, couldn't afford it. So they're hearing all that stuff day in, day out, and they know how to approach it, how to handle it, what language to use. I'd say in a medical kind of setting as well, you'd probably have some kind of research ethics sort of flow of what you would do to sort of escalate something. So you might need to go to an external body and find out advice on how to answer a specific question, for instance, or if someone's in distress, pointing them to resources where they can get help, making sure that they can get help and they have got someone there that they can talk to, that they are comfortable talking to as well. So it may not be all on you as a researcher, because we're social researchers. We're not psychiatrists. We're not caregivers. But just having those protocols in place, like I say, of if X happens, we will do Y, I think is really useful.
Yeah, thanks. Now that you mention it, it sounds really obvious, but you really did give me a new direction, and I can talk with my team about it. So thank you very much for your input.
I wanted to jump in as well, just because I asked a similar question during the chat, and I have asked a similar question at a similar event. I'll stop using the word similar, but Brian Corbett had a pretty good response. I don't know if you can see his response in the chat, but basically he said, make sure they understand that they can stop whenever they need. At the beginning, it's a study that will likely bring up trauma, make sure they understand the purpose of the research, and then you can't predict trauma responses. Sometimes all you can do is stop so you don't make it worse, which, that's what you're worried about. And then the other answer from a different session was basically the point is to rebuild trust in order to kind of overcome the response. But you want to show sincerity, accept and admit to the potential trauma that may be occurring, and then apologize and try not to dwell on it. Try to move forward if they're willing. Otherwise, offer to reschedule or some other readjustment, and then allow time for that whole warm up to begin with. So, yeah, because a lot of times a traumatized or marginalized person doesn't necessarily consider themselves to be traumatized or marginalized in their daily life. So it can happen at any time, in any study. So good luck.
Right, or even to us, like maybe we're the ones conducting the interview, but something triggers us and we didn't even know about it. But completely agree with you. And yeah, I think I read that message, but even then I have everything you said in my mind. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. I see we have one more hand raised. We just have a few minutes left. Abdul Rahman, do you want to give a quick question? Or I don't know if your hand's just left over.
Perhaps a quick question. Yeah, thank you. I am a beginner, and it seems to me that there's a long road for me to walk. I do a lot of solutioneering. Any tips, perhaps, on to let go of this?
Sorry, do you mind repeating? You do a lot of what?
I do a lot of focusing on outputs rather than outcomes. Yeah, and my boss picks up on this and she reorients me. But I would love to have this behavior change within me, or maybe mindset change. But I'm not sure how. I could really use some tips, I guess.
Does anyone have quick advice for Abdul?
I have a very quick advice. I don't know how to raise my hand digitally. I can just wave.
Perfect.
If there's enough light here, just to wave. So Jared Spool has excellent series on this topic, so you can Google him, and all his seminars are free. He has seminars, I think every Monday, every Tuesday, something like that. So he talks a lot about that, a lot about outputs versus outcomes. So we as researchers should obviously focus on outcomes versus outputs. We of course deliver journey maps and our insights and listening channel reports and whatnot, and all the data analysis. But I think he'll be a good resource for you to start kind of trying to differentiate and actually gaining and learning about the language that we should be using to talk about this. I think because we do understand the importance, but not it's not easy to talk about it, especially if we're used to be doing this tactical UX stuff. A lot of us, like, you know, I've been in the field for more than 20 years, and I was doing UX design up until like 2008, and it was all tactical, it was all reactive, and slowly but surely I moved into more strategic, but that's, you know, that's taken a decade. So that would be my 2 cents, if that's helpful.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very helpful indeed.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. That was a great conversation, and I hope you guys all had a great time today in terms of our talk with Tiziana and discussions afterwards. Just as a quick reminder, please fill out our survey, as I mentioned before, and then also follow us on our social media platforms to stay up to date with our upcoming events, our next being in November. And we appreciate you guys all coming and hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.